Welcome everybody to chapter 12, where we want to apply the ISLM model. Like in chapter 11, we derived the ISLM model. It took us a full chapter to come up with this relationship between the LM curve, the IS curve in an interest rate income diagram. But we did not work with this model, and this will change in chapter 12, where we are going to apply the ISLM model to arrive at very important insights. So this is the structure of chapter 12. So once more, I will split it in several videos. Let's start with the introduction. It is the case that the ISLM model has played a central role in the history of economic thought, and it offers a powerful lens through which to view the economic history. But it also has to offer a lot with respect to explaining modern developments in the economy. So we will use this ISLM model to highlight why it is the case that the classical view that markets are always in an equilibrium is wrong, and that shocks to goods demand can lead to a recession. So we are able to use this Keynesian model in order to explain fluctuations in the business cycle. This is very important to understand the Great Depression of the 1930s, but it's also very important to understand the recent financial crisis in 2008-2009. The structure of this chapter is more or less as follows: that we want to talk about potential causes of fluctuations in GDP. Then we also would like to use the ISLM model to explain the slope and the position of the AD curve. So slope of the ID curve, this is obvious what it means. Position, it implies that the AD curve can shift in case that something happens in the ISLM model. So we'll focus on that in the second part. And then in the last part, we will examine the Great Depression on the basis of this theoretical model. In this video here, I will reverse the order within subsection 12.1. So at first, I will discuss the part shocks in the ISLM model, and afterwards I'll discuss how fiscal and monetary policy affect GDP. Why is it the case that I reverse the order? It's because this allows me to pick a negative shock first, which causes a recession. And afterwards we can examine whether fiscal policy or monetary policy is the right medicine in order to cure the disease. I think it's important to reverse the order and the structure of this chapter so that you understand that in the beginning there is a problem and then we are looking for a solution. I don't think it's very intuitive that first you come up with a solution and afterwards you are talking about the problem. So let's talk about the problems first. Keynes argued that changes in demand can arise from investors' animal spirits. Animal spirits implies that maybe the real cause which is leading to a recession is not very obvious. So there is no big change in macroeconomic fundamentals. It's not the case that there is a big earthquake which is destroying like production facilities or killing the labor force. It's not that obvious. So it's almost the case that no macroeconomic fundamental change, but nevertheless suddenly there is a recession. And Keynes labels these kind of events as animal spirits. That animal spirits cause these kind of recessions. When it comes to animal spirits, we have to think about expectations. Expectations of the consumers, expectations of the managers, The consumers are responsible for consumption. The managers are responsible for investment. And we know already that the investment component of GDP is pretty unstable, is pretty volatile. And it might be the case that the expectations of the managers drive the investment decisions, and expectations to some extent are unobservable. Therefore, Keynes argues that maybe exogenous and perhaps self-fulfilling waves of optimism and pessimism drive the business cycle. So what does self-fulfilling mean? In case that the managers believe that there is a recession in the future. It's just an expectation. But when the managers cut back investment, then there is a lower demand for investment goods, lower demand for goods, and the recession starts. This is meant by self-fulfilling. In case that enough private households or enough managers believe that there will be a recession, the recession will start. In case that managers are pessimistic, they will cut back investment, they will lower investment, and we can reduce the autonomous component of consumption, B0, in our goods demand relationship, and this will shift the IS curve to the left. Or we could argue that the consumer confidence is down. This leads to lower consumption, and in our ISLM model, we are able to reduce the autonomous component of consumption C0, which will also lead to a shift of the IS curve to the left. Furthermore, we could also model money demand shocks. We could assume that private households believe that the commercial banking sector is unstable, and therefore the private households are increasing money demand. So they are going to a bank, they are withdrawing money, and afterwards they are storing the money under the pillow. In case that this occurs, we can increase the autonomous component of money demand, D0, and this will shift the LM curve to the left. Let's talk about these shocks in a graphical way. We can see here the initial equilibrium in the ISLM model, and now a negative goods demand shock arrives. So it might be the case that B0, the autonomous component of investment, decreases, or that C0, the autonomous component of consumption, decreases. This will shift the IS curve to the left, and hence we get a new equilibrium here in point B, where the interest rate is lower, but GDP is also lower. And this is very important that GDP is lower, because here it will be the case that we end up in a recession. GDP is lower, and therefore also the demand for labor is lower, and this goes hand in hand with a higher unemployment rate. So in scenario B, the unemployment rate is higher than in scenario A. Point B is an equilibrium, so in case that nothing else happens, we will stay in scenario B forever. We will stay in a recession forever. On slide 7, we had a look at a negative goods demand shock, a shock which arrives at the good market, and therefore the IS curve shifts to the left. Let's have a look at a money demand shock, an increase in money demand. We have once more indicated the initial equilibrium in point A. Scenario A is the initial equilibrium, interest rate is at the level RA, and GDP at the level YA. In case that money demand increases, this will lead to a shift of the LM curve to the left. D0, the autonomous component of money demand, increases, which shifts the LM curve to the left. Also here, it is the case that we end up in a recession. The GDP level in scenario B is lower than the GDP level in scenario A. But the effect on the interest rate is different. It is the case that the interest rate increases. This is pretty important when it later on comes to the Great Depression. because of the fact that we will talk about these slides once more. For now, it is very important to understand that these kind of shocks, like B0 decreases, C0 decreases, or money demand increases, leads to a recession. The GDP level is lower than before, and now we can check whether fiscal policy or monetary policy can help. Is it the case that fiscal policy or monetary policy are able to cure the problem, and the problem is, like, the GDP level is on a lower level, and now we want to check what happens if the government increases government spending or decreases taxes, and what happens if the central bank is increasing money supply. Like here we have the first graph, which is related to an increase in government spending. The initial equilibrium here is point A, and we want to assume that in point A the economy is in a recession. The economy is in a big recession, unemployment rates are high, and now the question is, will an increase in government spending help to solve this problem? Will it lead to a higher GDP level so that unemployment rate decreases? Yes, this seems to be the case. The IS curve shifts to the right, and the economy is in the end in the new equilibrium B, where indeed it is the case that the GDP level is higher compared to the first scenario. So an increase in government spending helps. But it's also mentioned here in the textbook that this increase in the interest rate also limits the effectiveness of the fiscal policy, because there is one effect which is called the interest rate induced crowding out effect. Since also the interest rate increases, it's the case that the investment level will be lower in scenario B than in scenario A, and hence this increase in the interest rate limits the effectiveness of the fiscal policy. In the following, I would like to talk about the transmission mechanism. How does the economy arrive at the new equilibrium B? What is the adjustment process from point A to point B? I'm very detailed on the next slide, so a very detailed analysis. A lot of steps are necessary to explain this movement, but I think it's important and worth it to be very precise. So let's start. How do we get from point A to point B? In the beginning, the government increases government spending. This leads to an increase in goods demand. Goods demand is larger than goods supply. And here, in this model, we assume that the companies are adjusting the supply. The companies are producing more. They are not increasing prices in this situation, because in the short run, it is the case that the prices are sticky. Prices will only change in the long run. So this surplus in goods demand does not increase prices, but the companies will produce more. When the companies produce more, it is the case that the income generated in the production process will increase. This will boost consumption, and the multiplier effect kicks in. Like here, you can see 5 arrows upwards because of the fact that the initial impulse causes a multiplier effect and GDP increases to a larger extent than the initial impulse. Now we know what's going on the goods market. But what's going on the money market? There is a spillover effect from the goods market to the money market because of the fact that an increase in GDP affects money demand. money demand increases, money demand is larger than money supply. The private households want to hold more money, and therefore they are trying to sell bonds. They are trying to sell bonds so that in the end they have more money. Bond supply is larger than bond demand, and the bond prices decrease. When the bond prices decrease, this implies that the interest rate increase, the yield, the return on these bonds increases, and this lowers money demand because of the fact that the opportunity cost of holding money increase. Now we have another spillover effect from the money market to the goods market. It's a case that an increase in the interest rate affects investment negatively. When the interest rate increases, there is a negative sign in the investment function, then investment decrease. This lowers demand for investment goods, supply is larger than demand, GDP decreases, a negative multiplier effect kicks in, and GDP decreases here by 2 arrows. So in the end, when we compare the effectiveness in a pure goods market model, like in the Keynesian cross, it would be the case that GDP increases like by 5 arrows. But here it's a case that due to the spillover effect from the money market to the goods market, it is the case that investment is lower, and therefore GDP is lower than in a pure Keynesian cross model. We call this effect here the interest rate induced crowding out effect, which reduces the effectiveness of fiscal policy on GDP. This is also mentioned in the textbook. So in the textbook it is mentioned that in a pure model of the Keynesian cross, GDP would increase from A to this level here, from A to, let's say, A prime. But in this ISLM model, the interest rate increases and hence the effect is lower. So the distance between A prime and B, this is the interest rate induced crowding out effect, which lowers the effectiveness of a fiscal policy. So let's sum up with respect to the fiscal policy in the ISLM model. A fiscal policy is effective in increasing GDP. The economy will get out of recession, but the size of the multiplier is lower in the ISLM model compared to the Keynesian cross because of this interest rate induced crowding out effect. Let's have a look at money supply. What happens if the central bank increases money supply? Does it also lead to a boom? We are starting in scenario A. It is the case that in scenario A, the economy has a problem, the economy is in a recession, GDP level is very low, and the unemployment rate is pretty high. When the central bank increases money supply, the LM curve shifts downwards or to the right, and therefore the new equilibrium in point B is at a higher rate of GDP. So GDP is higher in situation B compared to situation A, and hence also an expansionary monetary policy is able to cure the problem of a low GDP level. An increase in money supply is the right medicine to reduce the unemployment rate. Also here, I would like to talk about the transmission mechanism. So how is it the case that we get from point A to point B? We start at the money market because it's a money market shock. The central bank is increasing money supply. if you want to, you can use the assumption of helicopter money. So the household wakes up, and suddenly each household in our economy find money in front of the house. Big question is, what is a household doing? A lot of students, they argue that the household is going shopping, but this is not the case. The household is not going shopping here because of the fact that an increase in money supply doesn't affect consumption. When you look at the consumption function, it's a case that consumption depends on an autonomous component. It depends on marginal propensity to spend and disposable income, but consumption does not depend on money. So when the private household is finding money in front of the house, it's the case that the private household is not going shopping. It's not backed by the consumption function. But it's a case that money supply is larger than money demand. There is more money available compared to what the private household is willing to hold, and therefore, in a first step, the private household is trying to buy bonds. Bond demand is up. Bond demand is larger than bond supply, which leads to an increase in bond prices. When the bond prices increase, then it is the case that the interest rate decreases. When the interest rate decreases, money demand increases again. These are the mechanisms which occur on the money market. But due to the decrease in the interest rate, we have a spillover effect from the money market to the goods market, because it leads to higher investment. When the interest rate decreases, investment is up. This leads to an increase in goods demand because the demand for investment goods is up. Demand is larger than supply. The companies are not increasing prices, but the companies are producing more. The income generated in the production process is up. Therefore, consumption is affected and income increases. We also have a multiplier effect here. What is important is that consumption increases through an indirect effect. So it's not the case that money supply directly affects consumption, but money supply through a very long chain of adjustments, it is the case that GDP is affected, so that income is affected, and then consumption will pick up. This is very important to understand, that there is no direct link between money supply and consumption. There is only this indirect link via GDP. Due to the increase in GDP, we have a spillover effect from the goods market to the money market. When GDP increases, the number of transactions increases, and therefore money demand increases. Now we can stop to discuss this shock, because we can explain why in the end the money market is in an equilibrium. The central bank increased money supply, and money demand is up because of the fact that the interest rate is down, and money demand is up because of the fact that GDP increased. Furthermore, we are also able to explain how the endogenous variables reacted. We are able to explain why the interest rate decreases and why GDP increased. This is the end of the first video. Thank you very much for participating, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.